Hey guys, this is Matt with the Recklessly Skeptical podcast.
And this is Josh,
And this is Joe.
your friendly neighborhood Joe.
That's right.
We don't live in the same neighborhood though.
Well, I mean, he's everybody's friendly neighborhood Joe.
Yeah.
Joe, you don't know what Joe does? He drives around and sleeps in different neighborhoods at different nights.
It's true.
Joe, that's kind of creepy.
I
man.
have a different neighborhood for every night of the week.
So Monday it's Sandy, Tuesday it's Taylorsville.
Mm-hmm.
When do you sleep in my neighborhood?
Ooh, your neighborhood is a little more dirty, so I don't come over here.
I like
Very
my
honest.
neighborhood. Whoa, jeez.
I'm more of like the next neighborhood over.
Yeah, should I shut the window so we don't get shot up afterwards?
Yes. All right, so today's April 30th, 2017, and today we are going to have an awesome discussion with a professor at the U, Gregory Clark.
Dr. Gregory Clark.
Dr. Gregory Clark. But first, we're going to get going with our stolen thought.
Woo.
So I found it fitting today that today we had a stolen thought from Carl Sagan. Here we go. Quote, "We live in a society exquisitely dependent on science and technology in which hardly anyone knows anything about science and technology." End quote.
Yeah, that's funny. And that's one of the things that when I get into like party debates with people about science and stuff is that we're like we take advantage of electricity. Nobody would question whether electricity is a real thing, but they want to question like evolution and evolution. Like we get the benefits of tests we run on rats. If we didn't have a genetic compatibility with them to some degree, none of the medicine that we did with rats would ever work on humans.
Yeah. Evolution is the foundation of.
Yeah, and I brought that up. I called one of those. I think it was 855 for Truth. One of those billboards, and that's one of the things I brought up. And it was just kind of funny, like to hear him like not know what to say because I knew.
Wait, what billboard?
Have you seen those 1855 truth billboards? It's like, do you know Jesus? Call 1855 truth.
Maybe I haven't
Dude,
looked
I mean,
They're
there's-
all over, bro.
Yeah,
Really?
the one I saw was on my way back from Magna. I was visiting my sister out in Magna, and it was like I can't remember what it said. And there's one downtown in Salt Lake City. Like when you come back, it's on the left hand side, and it says, "Are you afraid of death?"
Oh,
Yep.
okay.
And if you're heading south on I-15 going into Utah County, you'll see them there as well.
Really?
Oh yeah, and the one from Magna. This is I couldn't stop because it's like, or do you want evidence? And so I'm like, yeah, I want fucking
Yeah,
evidence. So
sure.
I called and he had
Hit me with your best shot. Dun it.
yeah, and I'm like, so your billboard mentioned evidence. Could you tell me about that? And he's like, well, and then instead of giving me evidence, of course,
Yeah.
he started going into this diatribe about how science is wrong, and it's like, God damn it. But yeah, I was.
So you hit him.
Yeah,
with some science knowledge.
Yeah, so I questioned him about the origin of humanity and about the Noah's Ark. I'm like, well, but you have to understand that these animals can't survive because I'm like, do you believe that the water went above the highest mountain, and which would be Everest? And he said, yeah. And then I was like, do you understand that most animals can't acclimate to high altitudes like that? So a lot of them would have died in that thing. So I can't easily believe that. And like he was just like didn't know what to say, and then I started getting into some theological stuff, and I knew the Bible better than him. Surprise, surprise.
Did you tell him about how Japan was around during the time of the flood, and it was one of the most chronicalized times in history, in their history, and they don't mention a flood at all?
No, I mean it wouldn't matter. I was just trying to. My main purpose on that phone call, after I realized that I knew more about the Bible than he did, was to make him start asking some of the deeper questions. So that was my hope. I don't know if that's what I got across.
Know, that would be cool if you did get him to think about it, and maybe one day we could bring him on the show.
Yeah.
Like, well, Josh just started asking me questions, and now I don't believe, and yeah, here I am.
And it's funny that he starts trying to poke holes in science because you could grant him the argument that all of science is wrong, and he still is at the starting line.
Yeah, with
proving the existence of his God.
Yeah, just if he proved evolution wrong, it does not prove his God right.
Exactly. And that's the pill to mystery is a form of a pill to ignorance.
Yeah.
But it's saying because we don't know what happened at the beginning of the universe, then therefore God. And it's like that doesn't work at all. It doesn't follow. So I have the Gallup Daily Trump job approval rate poll. Let's just go through it. Real unemployment is at 8.9. Gallup Good Jobs is at 44.8. Engaged at work is 32.4. Economic confidence is down to 5, which is still on the positives. Consumer spending is still high at 106, and Trump has rebounded a little bit. He went down a bit this week, and then he rebounded because for some reason on Saturdays and Sundays people like Trump more. But he's at 42% when he was down to 39 at one point in the week. At this rate, at day 160, he'll have caught up to Bill Clinton if he can hold these numbers, but we'll have to see. All right, and then let's talk a little bit about Gregory Clark. You mentioned him in our story last week or 2 weeks ago?
I believe it was last week. I quoted one of his Facebook posts because it was regarding the Science March, and I've been seeing a lot of shit online regarding science and debating it, and I thought, you know what? I think it would be great to have Greg on and talk about some science.
Yeah, and I know you reached out to him, so and for me, something that I think is important, and I know that we'll hear it throughout the conversation, is that for science to work, like the scientific method seems to be this balance between curiosity and skepticism. It's not purely one or the other, because pure skepticism tends to be nihilism, and pure curiosity, you believe whatever the fuck anybody tells you.
Gullibility.
Yeah. And so I think that that's a good balance. So, Matt, if you want to introduce him, that would be fantastic.
All right. We are here with Gregory A. Clark. He is an associate professor in the Department of Bioengineering at the University of Utah. We're glad to have you here, Greg.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, guys. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. We wanted to discuss science today, but first, why don't you give a little more of an introduction, and we'll get to talking about what work you're doing, what amazing work you're doing, and then we will talk about some other things.
The work that I'm doing, in simple terms, is to provide a sensorized, motorized prosthetic hand to a user. We don't make the hand, but our job would be to plug it into the user's remaining nervous system and muscles after hand amputation, so that in the end they could move the hand just by thinking about it, and they could get a sense of touch and of movement back from the hand again, and ideally even feel whole again. I'm here today to talk perhaps a little bit about our work, but more broadly to talk about science and science literacy, what it means for society and what it means for us as individuals.
Great. That's awesome. So we were discussing a little bit before the podcast about your work and how you use the word crude, which I thought was interesting because I'm sure that for us it's very precise and amazing, but with how complicated it is, I'm sure in your eyes it is crude. Can you tell us a little bit about how it works?
The basic idea is to take advantage of the biology that already exists. So when I used the word crude earlier, I meant it's crude with respect to the sensitivity, the resolution, the dexterity that you all actually have now with your hands, right? Your hands are incredibly nimble. They can touch an object and feel resolution down under 2 millimeters. And that requires lots of different neurons. And so we don't interface to the nervous system quite that precisely, but we're doing a pretty good job. It's just that in comparison with the natural biology that already exists, we're tapping in only to a very small part of it, relatively speaking. Still, when one uses artificial devices, the biggest difference in function comes from having nothing to having something, and then going from something to have something more. So we are pleased that, in fact, in our situations, a user is able to control what are called 9 degrees of freedom, so 9 different movements of the hand. So, for example, moving your pointer finger, flexing it and extending it would be 1 degree of freedom. So you got 5 digits, so you should have at least 5 degrees of freedom, but your thumb is really complicated, so it can flex and extend, but it'll also move close to the midline and away from it. So you get those, and then you have the wrist, and the wrist can do 3 different movements, and so you put them all together, and you have lots of degrees. You have 22 degrees of freedom in the hand. You can even do, I can't, but some people can do this, the Star Trek thing, and so that's another degree of freedom, right? So providing lots of different movements and beginning to move towards dexterity so that the prosthetic hand could mimic the natural biological hand is one important goal. The other important goal is providing senses of touch and movement back again. And you have thousands of sensors in your hand, each of which covers a very small area, very small pixels. And so you can feel very fine texture. And moreover, there's different types of sensors for pressure, sensors for temperature, sensors for vibration. And so in the real world, when you touch an object, you have a sense of the whole object. You do sensor fusion. Your brain puts this together. I pick up this cup, which is in front of me, and I pretty much know it's a cup, even if my eyes are closed.
Yeah.
And if you think about what I had to do in order to have that sensation or perception, it's really quite deep. I had to take and integrate information across sensors that were in different parts of my body, the different fingertips, my thumb, perhaps my palm. I had to integrate information from my muscles saying this is light, this is heavy. Coming even from my fingertips, there would be the sense of texture. So there'd be pressure sensors, there'd be a sense of temperature. And I put that all together, and the brain somehow takes all that different pathways of sensory information and integrates them across space and across quality to activate a memory of what a cup is.
Yeah.
So we can't stimulate the brain to activate percept of cup, but if we provided all the detailed information coming from the periphery of all the pixels of information, the brain would fuse those just as it normally does. As I was alluding to earlier, this is actually done to some extent with a cochlear prosthesis where a person would be profoundly deaf. You stimulate the auditory nerve that comes from the ears. The reason the person is deaf is they're missing the transducers that take sound and movement and translate it into electrical activity. So they're as deaf almost as you would be if you were missing, as you would be blind if you were missing your eyeballs, right? Your brain still works, but they're not getting the sensory information. So if we can activate the auditory nerve in just the way that it would normally have been activated by sound, the same spatial and temporal patterns of activity, the brain would interpret it just the way it normally does, and it would end up with understanding language, which is exactly what happens. Again, it's crude in the sense that the number of points of activation of the auditory nerve is small compared with the independence of activation that happens with the real biological transducers, but it's good enough to understand speech, which is really remarkable. And so what we're trying, and that's in common use today in the United States. Thousands of people, tens of thousands of people have these devices. So what we're trying to do is kind of the body equivalent. You don't have your hand anymore, but if we activate all the biological wires that come from your hand in just the same spatial temporal pattern that they would have been activated, then the brain would still feel your hand.
Yeah. And I liked your analogy of the Luke Skywalker hand in Star Wars. Yeah.
Well, we don't.
Star Trek.
No, it's
We don't. Just to be clear, we, the University of Utah, do not make the hand. The hand is made by a company called DECA, which is probably best known for the Segway scooter.
Oh,
thingy.
really?
Yeah.
That's cool.
But, just so that I'm not to blame for the sensationalism, they were the ones that called it the Luke hand, okay? For pretty obvious reasons.
Yeah.
So along with your research, are you actually attaching the prosthetic hands, and are you only doing the research?
We are doing this in the laboratory. The long-term goal, which we're shooting to hit about 2 years from now, is for a user to have a take-home system. But we are indeed attaching it in the laboratory, and the person is using it in the real world for some scientific tasks so that we can evaluate it more carefully, and then some real-world tasks, which are called in the field activities of daily living.
Oh, okay.
And a lot of these may seem prosaic to us, which speaks to the issue of just how much we use our hands without really recognizing what we have, right? So the old saying goes, you don't know what you got till it's gone, right, Joni Mitchell? And it's true. And so if you've ever done something like broken a collarbone and not be able to use one hand, you suddenly find it's like difficult in a one-handed world. And some of our subjects have both hands that are amputated. And that's like really more difficult. So as just examples, we asked our subject what he wanted to do, and here's one that like wouldn't have struck you necessarily, except as soon as you think about it. What I like to put on a ring.
Oh.
Okay, imagine putting and taking, like, how do you do that if you don't have another hand to do it?
Yeah.
I want to put a pillow in a pillowcase.
A simple
It
things we do every day.
seems simple to us, but like it's actually a three-handed task. So if you are down to two hands, it's already challenging. How to use your chin or the table, or right?
Yeah.
Down to one hand, how do you put the pillow in there while you're using your other hand to hold it open, right?
Yeah.
But equally importantly, how you interact with the world very much is dependent on our hands. And so, feeling the touch of a loved one, for example, even though that's a unilateral hand device, that's something that's really quite meaningful. Yeah. And in one of our experiments, which maybe we'll get to or not, one of the first times he was wearing one of these sensorized, motorized hands, we asked him what he wanted to do after we were done with our scientific experiment. And so it was over. We weren't measuring anything anymore. And just anecdotally, he said, I want to grasp my hands together.
Yeah.
And so we took out the testing device we'd been using, and he reached out and felt his hands together for the first time in 13 years.
Wow.
And then shortly thereafter, we were having another session, and he brought his wife in to show kind of what he could do with his new hand. And they held hands together with his amputated hand for the first time in over a decade.
Nice.
So there's a really human component to this that's hard to capture with scientific tests.
Yeah.
But is really quite important. One subject described it to me as that when you lose your hand, it's like losing a family member.
Yeah.
Except every day, you wake up and you're reminded of the loss once again.
Yeah.
So if we could begin to restore that, there's a really important human component that's not self-evident from their ability to do two-point discrimination or how dexterously they can move a block from one side to another.
And I hear a lot of amputees too. They'll like dream that they're, they have both their hands or whatever. And I even hear people who are
Paraplegic?
Yeah, they'll dream they're walking, and they'll dream, But then when you wake up, you're reminded every day because, you see it and it's there right in your face.
Which is not to say that these people aren't incredibly resilient. They are, especially the ones that volunteer to come into our experiments, and they have often established very real and very rich lives.
Yeah.
Similarly with spinal cord injury, there's a wonderful book by Reynolds Price, who is a Southern author of some renown, and he's mostly known for his literary works, but he also suffered from spinal cord injury due to cancer. Okay. And he wrote a book about that experience, a nonfiction book, and it's called A Whole New Life. Now, when you and I hear that title of the book, you probably think of something like, okay, my life is wholly different. It's just like completely different. It's a whole new life. And of course he does allude to that throughout the book, but there's a really poignant passage towards the end where he describes how it took him several years to transition from asking the question of why me to what next.
Oh, okay.
And he says, in looking back retrospectively, his life has been richer in many ways because of his injury, because of what it allowed him to focus on, of what was really, really important. Not just the superficial things that sometimes we get trapped up in, but things of deeper significance. And then he reveals, if you haven't figured it out by yet reading the book, that there's another meaning to the title, A Whole New Life, which is that his life is whole again, that it's complete. And so coming to grips with new realities is a challenge we all face in one way or another as the world changes, as our life circumstance changes. But for people who suffer injuries of one sort or another, it can be particularly poignant and particularly deep and particularly challenging. Not everybody successfully meets that challenge, but the subjects that come into our experiment by definition have met that challenge, and they have very rich lives, very meaningful lives, and to be quite honest, impress me very much with what they're able to do compared with what they can't. But we want to restore even more to the original condition.
I just hope if I'm ever put in that situation, I could
apply and get accepted.
no, but you know.
Oh, find yourself.
Well,
Find myself
there
in
is
the-
a sanity check we have to put you through, dude.
Oh, okay,
Sorry.
never
you
mind.
know.
You're screwed, Joe.
Yeah, I'm screwed. Yep.
You know, hearing you talk about that, it almost brings a tear to my eye. It's sad, and then it's also amazing, like you said. And I am honestly thankful that you are doing this work and trying to make these people whole again, like you said.
Well, thank
I'm
you.
glad you're not just, praying that they, become better, and
There
you're
is
actually
that.
applying science and critical thinking and
As Marshall Brain's famous challenge goes out, why won't God heal amputees? But before going there, I'll just comment because it's quite appropriate. I'm here as a spokesperson. This is a large-scale effort. Certainly at the University of Utah, we have surgeons, we have other investigators that are absolutely key to this enterprise. It builds upon a decade of research that was going on before I even arrived.
Yeah.
I'm in the right place at the right time. It builds upon teams throughout other parts of the country and even world, making the arm, making virtual reality environments that we can use, integrating across these different groups to make this all happen. Some important regulatory issues that you have to face when you're dealing with human populations. So I'm here as one individual representing what's going on, communicating what's going on, but let me be clear, this is truly a multi-person, multi-team effort, and it takes a whole bunch of people to make this happen. And one thing we may come back to when we talk about science is it's great for me to be here today to talk about the end results as if it just sort of happened. But what science takes is a lot of grunt work, which isn't always so exciting. Like, I love the webpage, I fucking love science, right? Because there's all this exciting stuff. But I truly recognize that that's the bling, right? Which captures the public attention. And there's a lot of non-exciting work that goes into, 10 years of developing the electrode that never makes the news.
Yeah.
Because, frankly, it's the small incremental progress that makes a transition between, the first ever, which might be newsworthy, and the Inhumans, which might be newsworthy. But if without that, it would just be, really just bling. So the Wright brothers took off, right? Pretty amazing, right? They actually went up in the air, first time ever, if you buy certain versions of the story. In a practical sense, being in the air for 10 seconds doesn't have any utility, right? And now we get on the plane, we go to Europe, right? Hundreds of people aboard. That took thousands and thousands of intermediate steps, not all of which captured, very much attention.
Well, I think the Wright brothers, too, they were at it for years before they even took flight for the 10 seconds that they did.
That's also true. And likewise for the artificial heart. The first implant was done in animals, and the survival was on the order of a couple of minutes, right? Not practical, right? And yet now we can do it, and people get years in their life.
Yeah.
So there's a non-glamorous part of science, which sometimes isn't communicated, but is a really, really important part. And that's one reason why science, supporting science in the larger sense, is really, really key, right? It does take long-term sustained efforts. Commercialization, of course, is important for it to reach the larger scale of people, but most companies are not willing to invest on this small incremental progress because the return to them isn't sufficient to justify their existence. We are in a capitalistic society, which has, some real benefits to it. But one of the downsides is that no company can afford to invest in something that's going to cost it money.
Yeah.
That's not its job, right? That's not its role. And so we as a society need to band together to bring solutions to the point where they can be commercialized. Because in the end, we all benefit in a very, very practical way from that. And that's part of what supportive science is all about, is there's a time in development where we, as a group of people, as a large group of people, are going to benefit from this large-scale investment. And yet, in the early days, it's not commercially viable necessarily for a company to make that investment. Same thing with lots of stuff like vaccines, right?
Yeah.
We could get to anti-vax stuff later too. But, vaccines have a short life, right? And so it's really challenging if there weren't government support to develop this stuff and to support it for any one company to make money off of it. And so we need to band together as a larger group of people, recognizing that there are large benefits to society that go beyond what any individual investor might be able to recoup.
Yeah.
I think that's a perfect segue to the article you wrote in the Salt Lake Tribune, the op-ed, Faith is a Horribly Unreliable Tool for Determining Reality. So everybody knows we had a March for Science, and the March for Science, I would say, was a result because of our current administration's attack on science. And then here in Salt Lake, we have our March for Science, and it's filled with religious woo. And I actually quoted you, Greg, on our last podcast.
Thanks.
I thought your Facebook post before you wrote this article was spot on.
It was a mic drop moment. Like, by the time he finished reading it, we were like, I think it.
Josh was like, did he drop the fucking mic?
Yeah, for real.
Yeah.
So with that said, and if nobody's read the article, go to the Salt Lake Tribune. It's an op-ed. Read it. It's great.
And we'll link it in the Facebook group page.
Yes, we will link it there. So considering our current administration and even the general public here in the U.S., where our science literacy is nil to none, depending on who you talk to, what are your views on that? I know that's a vague question, Greg, but how do you see science literacy in the normal person in the U.S. and within the Trump administration?
There's two related issues, and they're intrinsically intertwined, but somewhat separable at the extremes. And one is the knowledge that's gained. So science has, in fact, advanced our body of knowledge, and we ignore that at our peril, and I mean that in a very real way. The deeper related issue is that science is not only a compilation of knowledge, not only a set of fantastic advancements, technical and conceptual, but it's also a method. It's a method of understanding empirical reality. And the way they're related is as follows. It's a really good method, right? It actually works. And so this body of knowledge that we've accumulated, these advances that we've made depend upon that method. And that's why in this op-ed, I really point out that aspect of things. It's not only that we're getting drugs that help cure disease, we have an understanding of climate change. It's this deeper method which will serve not only to solve or help solve these particular problems, but will solve unknown problems that will arise in the future. And if you attack that method, right, that's in some ways an even deeper attack than cutting funding for a couple of years. Now, let me not minimize the real risk to scientific progress that will happen if we drop the budget by 18%, as Trump has tried to communicate. To digress into that, I think that's in part a bargaining target, right? You just go in, a tactic, and you just go in and make an outrageous claim, and then you back off to something that's still outrageous, but in comparison it seems reasonable, right? It's a flea market strategy. But, think about this. Most grants last about 4 to 5 years, so let's call it 5. And so if you drop 20% of the budget, that means, that's 1 year where there's no grants, right? And you can't have a pipeline that just stops for a year without having severe consequences. But going back to the previous point, it's this conceptual issue of how do we determine what's correct and what's incorrect? What are the tools that we use to distinguish between one and the other? And without any particular disrespect intended against this individual per se, I had to use his remarks as an example to show it's not a straw man, but yes, this guy Brigham Daniels got up and talked about how God had intervened in response to his desperate intercessory prayer to help save his wife from cancer. Now, the way he intervened is by getting a good surgical team, which is kind of okay. But the main issue is there a supernatural deity that's intervening? And my point is that once you start resorting to supernatural explanations, you are attacking the very methodology of science. And the same thing happened, a big backlash when I wrote about Mother Teresa. Now, she was actually a pretty horrible person, but my op-ed was hardly about that at all. There was half a sentence in the fact that about the real consequences, day-to-day consequences of her presumed charity. The overwhelming majority of the article was about the ideas that were being proposed that you could take a picture of Mother Teresa and put it on the chest of a person and cure cancer.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, right, if that were a picture of Oprah Winfrey, if somebody came to you and said, I just put a picture of Oprah Winfrey or Elvis Presley on this person's chest and it cured cancer, everybody would say that's quackery.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yet, right, in a very real world example, people were saying this really happened, right? The Catholic Church is one of the largest religions on the planet. It's not some wacko cult, deep in the Bible Belt with 20 people in it. It's the largest sect of Christianity, number one. And those people who didn't believe it were going, well, we should respect this idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What? Where? No.
And, it's this undeserved respect for magical thinking that is a real problem in this country or throughout the world. And I'm pretty sure, though I don't have a lot of inside information, that's exactly why the organizers invited this person to speak, is to pander to the religious community and say, look, even if you believe in religion, you can still be for climate change. You can still accept that. You can still argue that, this is compatible with my faith and we should do things to save the planet rather than exert dominion over it. But my argument is this, is if you are promoting a method, then you live by that method or die by that method. And if someone says, my faith says X, and that's a valid rationale, okay, you are justifying that rationale, and you are just as in deep doo-doo when that person says, my faith says kill the gays. You can't, argue that this is a good method when you want it, and then argue it's a bad method when you don't. And so, this undeserved respect is a real problem. If we, again, to use another analogy, someone said, I made a diagnosis on the basis of the answer of a magic 8-ball. Yeah. We go, okay, maybe the diagnosis is right, the magic 8-ball is right some of the time, and maybe it's wrong, but the problem is using a bad method, right? And you might think I'm burlesquing the issue or making fun of it, but, right, if I said, oh, my magic peepstone in a hat says this, then we're supposed to give that respect.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry. A magic peepstone I'm not sorry. Sorry, not sorry. Yeah. A magic peepstone in a hat is just as absurd as a magic 8-ball. And when Daniels got up and said, it's an embarrassment for people of faith to fight against empirical scientific findings, I'm sitting there going, my head's exploding. Dude, you just talked about this magical being intervening to cure cancer. You, as I presume Mormon, since you're a BYU prof, believe that the Book of Mormon is historically true because otherwise basically the whole religion is a hoax.
Yeah.
You, sir, are rejecting empirical reality on the basis of the faith. So if you want to claim embarrassment, you should be deeply embarrassed. And as a society, we should be deeply embarrassed that anybody is proposing that you can cure cancer with a locket with a picture of a saint on it, or not yet saint, that you can determine the history, the biological history, the natural history of the Americas by reading words of a magical peepstone in a hat. This is not an idea that should be deserved respect. And so the pushback I get that I'm not respecting these ideas is exactly right. And the problem is not that we're not giving these ideas enough respect. The problem is we're giving them too much.
I agree with you 100%.
They don't deserve respect. And to paraphrase Matt Dillahunty, faith is not a pathway to truth. And you can believe anything on truth. You can believe
on
that
faith.
Or on faith, sorry. You can believe anything on faith. You can believe that white people are superior to black people on faith. Hey, it's just my faith. It's just my faith. You have no right to question it. And they cherry pick when their faith, like you alluded to, they cherry pick when their faith is respectable. Oh, that they'll look at somebody else who has some bullshit belief and laugh at them or disregard. They'll laugh at the Scientologists. And the Scientologists are just as valid as your Mother Teresa picture on the chest claim. It's the exact same.
What bothers me most is they'll laugh at science and they'll laugh at things like evolution.
Yes.
You know, because it goes against their faith. You know what I mean?
Why are there still monkeys?
Yeah, why are there still monkeys? Well, why are there still wolves?
And we didn't evolve from monkeys if you actually understand evolution.
Yeah. But I don't know. And that's the big problem here. When you have your faith and it goes against the scientific method, if you're willing to push out the scientific method and push away skepticism because it's different, because it says something different than what your faith says, what your 2,000-year-old book says that was written by primitive people, that's a major issue in the United States, and that's something that we need to circumvent and that we need to get around. We need to stop this. We need to educate. We need to... It needs to end. It really does. Because we're going to get more people like Trump, more people who are trying to appease to their voters. It drives me nuts. When I heard that about our science march, I couldn't believe it. And I don't know, when I hear Trump says he wants to cut certain programs and funding and a lot of people online, I see it on Facebook, they don't care. You know, they're like, oh, good, yeah, cut it. And it's like, are you serious? That's a major issue if we cut certain things like that, like funding.
So I'm going to switch gears here and kind of move us over to climate change. And I'm going to go on a little science tirade. It's not going to be as good as Greg's, but I'm going to give it a shot. I wrote something down and I'm going to read it here. So, climate change is real. This isn't a matter of opinion. 90% of all scientific papers published regarding climate change have reached the same conclusion based on the evidence. Climate change is real and we are contributing to it. I've seen a lot of people saying science is never settled. Well, you're right in an absolute sense. Science doesn't claim absolutes. It looks at the evidence and bases its models and conclusions off of that evidence. So sure, do we absolutely know that the Earth goes around the sun? No. But is it settled? Absolutely. And when science makes a model or a prediction that turns out to be wrong, you know what makes that correction? More science, more evidence. So here are some evidences for climate change, and this is at climate.nasa.gov. So I'm just going to go down the list. You can go to NASA, climate.nasa.gov, and look further into these. So you have sea level rise, global temperature rise, warming oceans, shrinking ice sheets, declining Arctic sea ice, glacial retreat, extreme events, ocean acidification, decreased snow cover. So there's just a list of the evidence. Climate change is real.
Yeah, and they have all of the sources and the references. So how do you feel about science change? Or climate change? Let's see how many mistakes we can make.
We're going to make tons of mistakes.
Yeah, it's fun.
So I'm not a climate scientist, and the argument from authority is a dangerous one.
Yes.
Nonetheless, there is an overwhelming consensus, and what's unfortunate among many other things, but from a conceptual level, is the willingness of so many to disregard that consensus, not really because in true motivation that they're arguing against the argument from authority. They haven't done research to show that it's different. It's politically different. And sometimes, to some extent, it's religiously driven. And I can't remember the exact figure, but it's an embarrassingly large figure, 30 to 40% or so, think that the second coming is going to happen in our lifetimes. So please fact check this. I don't, but like it's more than, maybe it's 100 years, right? It's an astonishing number. And so, yeah, like who cares about what's going to happen in 2,000 years?
We're not going to be here. We'll be in heaven.
If heaven and earth have passed away and God has given us dominion over this planet. and on and on and on. And this really is a corporate attempt at discrediting scientific reality. And once again, when we go to the issue of methodology, right, motives do matter. And so if this is being driven by corporate interests, which in large part it is, and they're making the claim that it's about the science, which in very large part it's not, that's both deceptive and inappropriate, right? The time to affect change is now. We as humans are very bad at understanding long-term consequences. So we're naturally biologically disposed to attribute causality to events that happen closely in time. A bit of a digression here. I used to teach some of the psychology behind learning and study the things that happen in your brain that store memories that allow your brain to learn. And this is just one of those cues that we use about environmental contingencies that drive us, right? Because in the real world, if you hear a sound and then get hit, that sound isn't coupled like 40 days before, right? And so we're really biased. And I used to set up this experiment with Princeton undergraduates where they would actually peck keys to reduce their reinforcement. So it's kind of like a cognitive optical illusion, is that I think this is causing me to get more reward. Actually, it was causing them to get less reward, but I played around with the environmental factors to make it seem as if it were working, right? My point here is that we're really bad at understanding that what we do today will impact something 10 years from now, or that what we did 10 years ago is impacting us now. Yeah. Right? It doesn't carry the emotional valence to it, and it doesn't carry an intuitive intellectual understanding. Right? So it really takes science. It takes careful methodology to reveal these contingencies, these causal relationships. And so part of the challenge with this is that it's not self-evident that, look, just because I'm driving my car too much, that I'm changing the planet's temperature, because my little contribution, I don't see the consequences. Yeah. And they're not going to happen for years, and my small contribution is undetectable with normal measurement techniques of subjectivity. And so it takes this compendium of approaches, the variety of different metrics that you used to begin to establish beyond a reasonable doubt that the Earth climate is changing, and that humans are contributing to that climate change. And I use the word change here rather than warming, because one of the political routes of attack has been to say things like, oh, well, look, over here it's not warming. Well, it's warming as a whole, but you're right. In fact, the models, I mean, this is actually a good example of how politics are disingenuously changing the conversation. The models actually predict that there will be this variability, that, as you say, extreme events, that this will happen, but so will that. And the people who go and say, yeah, but so will that, they look at that and go, well, that doesn't fit with the model. Well, actually, that's because you're not understanding the real model, which is there will be these variations in both directions. On the whole, it's going in this way, but other things are going to happen. And to predict with that precision, the trends that are not all going in one way, but the other, shows some of the accuracy of the models. Are they imperfect? Well, yeah, right? But are they accurate on the whole? Accurate enough that we should take their predictions into account? The answer is yes, right? Mm-hmm. No one can predict the future with 100% accuracy, but I'm willing to bet that none of you who are arguing against climate change will jump out of an airplane without a parachute from 30,000 feet, head down with your ankles and feet tied together in a sailor's dive onto concrete on the grounds that you can't predict the future.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that reminds me of Senator Inhofe bringing a snowball onto the floor of the Senate. Firstly, just as an example of, it can't be warming because of
I have a fucking snowball.
Yeah. Yeah, the methodology there might be a little questionable. But do you see a lot of these politicians, you mentioned that as politicized, and I'm not sure if you can go into this in great depth, but do you see that they're willingly ignorant, or do you think that they're actually like distorting the truth intentionally to by saying, the science isn't in yet,
So is it willful ignorance or deliberate? it's a heterogeneous group of people. So certainly for some people, particularly in the common populace, it's probably ignorance. But without definitive evidence, the suggestive correlative evidence is that it's willful ignorance, that it's deliberate, that it's driven in part by political contributions. It's driven by the oil industry. It's driven in the same way that the tobacco industry argued against a causative link between smoking and lung cancer, right? There's a vested interest, and everything we know about human behavior says that when you have a conflict of interest, you will be biased. It is true that to some extent you can fight against that bias, but it's very, very difficult to do so. So there's a wonderful book, which I've alluded to in another op-ed on the issue of conflict of interest, called something to the effect of the honest truth about dishonesty. And here is the bottom line. All of us, and I don't exclude myself, all of us lie. But with the exception of a few sociopaths, most of us lie only insofar as we can convince ourselves that we're not lying.
Yeah.
Okay? And that's the wonderful thing about science. As Richard Feynman said, it's a way we have of not fooling ourselves, and we are the easiest people to fool.
Yeah.
So we set up this methodology, and the methodology doesn't care what we think, and it's impartial, and it's how we discriminate between what really is real and what isn't. And as a sidelight to that, just as a fun historical fact, arguably Charles Darwin set up the first conflict of interest committee because he got this manuscript from Wallace saying, oh my gosh, the theory of evolution, which was the same as his. And he goes, I can't decide this because I'm going to be biased. So he gave it over to the Royal Society, which of course were his buddies, so maybe it wasn't the perfect group of people to turn it over to, but still, right? It's a good move.
At least he tried.
Right.
He tried.
And so, if you're getting hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars for your company by being able to go forward, if politicians are getting huge contributions, it's hard for them to be impartial. But I would go further than that and say in some cases it's not only this subtle psychological fact, it's doing it because they really do want their businesses to go forward, and they want their political careers to go forward. There is a real dichotomy in what politics is all about.
Yeah.
And some people say, well, so let me ask the question to our listening audience. What is politics all about? And for me, rightly or wrongly, and this may show my own biases, my immediate answer would be politics and the government is about making society better for all the people.
Everyone.
And there's actually a group of people, and I think it was George Bush who said this, but in any case it was some politician. Politics is about making business better.
Not people.
Not people, business. That's why we have these structures, is to pave the way for businesses. That and to use another statement, what's good for GM is good for the country. Right?
Yeah.
And that is, a really different way of thinking. And so in the short term, which is where most corporate benefits are going to seek, right? It may be disadvantageous if you're in the coal industry to have these regulations, right? But businesses go. If businesses are no longer viable and there are better ways to do things that don't harm other people, right? That's the way we have to move, because, that is one of the fundamental principles is, if we talk about freedom, right, that the freedom to swing your fist ends where someone else's nose begins. Well, there's no action that doesn't have some consequence on somebody.
Yeah.
But the reality is we all breathe this air, right? We all drink this water. And those are public resources. They are not the resources of your particular company. And when you poison the air and you poison the water and you change the climate in such a way that you cause health consequences and destroy habitats, you're not any longer working in only commercial space. You're working in public space.
Yeah, exactly. I think it was Harvard who did the study that our politicians are more likely to pass laws and So even if the majority of Americans, 90% of Americans voted yes on something, if the elite campaign contributors disagreed and voted the opposite way, our politicians most likely will go towards them. And so it's not for the people anymore. Our politicians really aren't for the people, by the people. It's for the corporations, by the person with the most money. And unfortunately, it's the corporations and these big companies, pharmaceutical companies, oil companies, coal companies, motor companies that sway our legislation. And it's not the person, it's not the people, it's not the scientist, it's not the philosopher who has a say. And it should be the people and the scientist and the philosopher and this person and that person who should be saying which way our country should be going, and it's not going that way.
Yeah, a lot of people said they wanted Trump as president because he was a good businessman. But you don't want a businessman running your country.
Well, the
country is not a business.
Sorry.
It's just ridiculous that people think that way. The government isn't there to make money. The government is to do things for the people. And it's just funny how people looked at it that way when voting for Trump.
Every time I talk to somebody who voted for Trump and I asked him, and they were like, oh, well, he's a businessman and we need someone different into office. I go, do you realize half of our politicians have business degrees or law degrees? He's no different. You're like, he's a businessman. So are the rest of them.
Well, not only that.
Are you not paying attention?
It's been said that if you had taken his investments that he received by virtue of inheritance and just put them in the stock market, he would have been even richer than if he had done his business. So, that's not exactly a good businessman.
Yeah.
He went bankrupt multiple times, right? And I understand taking a risk is part of business, but you cannot, to use your comment about modeling what you want to do here with what you want to do there, you cannot bankrupt the United States 4 times.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. You have to have a different approach. And business in particular is a top-down approach where a CEO can often just say, this is the way it is, may have to convince the board of directors, which are basically his or her buddies, but certainly a very small group of people, and then just give the order, and everybody has to follow. And that's not what the president does. The president's power is mostly a power of persuasion. Mm-hmm. He, of course, holds the veto, which gives him a lot of indirect way to twist arms. But the laws are not passed by the president. They're passed by Congress, right? Which has got 2 houses and hundreds of people. And no, just because you say X does not mean that that's the law they're going to pass, right? And on top of that, those people are beholden more directly to their constituents, not to you. You, the president, don't get to fire them. You can say you're fired if you're Trump, right?
Yeah.
And you can't do that to a congressperson. So their real boss is back home. So you're quite right. The business model does not translate, both in terms of, number one, the goal, mm-hmm. and number 2, the method. And understanding that is key to understanding why he is presently proving relatively, independent of whether you like what he does, he's proving relatively ineffective on multiple metrics of the metrics he himself had set up for his first 100 days of office, mm-hmm. with the exception of the unfortunate appointment to the Supreme Court. But most of his other metrics, by his own evaluation, he didn't reach him, and that's in part why.
Well, I saw an article, too. He was saying that being president has turned out to be a lot harder than he thought it was going to be, and it's...
He's such an idiot.
Yeah.
Said the same thing with healthcare.
Yeah.
Who knew it could be so complicated?
Just about everybody else.
Yeah.
So let's go to another controversial science, and it's really not controversial when you know the science behind it, but evolution and creationism. Our favorite creationist, Ken Ham, tries to argue that we were created 6,000 years ago. You know a bit about biology. Would you mind commenting on that?
Yeah, I have a lot to say about that. Readers may want to look at an op-ed I wrote back on anniversary of Darwin's publishing of The Origin of the Species, and several letters to the editor since. So here's what worries me the most. It's not just the Ken Hams of the world. It's the, quote, respectable moderate theists here.
Yeah.
All right? So Williams Jennings Bryan is the prosecutor in the Scopes trial, right? And through a remarkable, truly remarkable series of events, he ended up on the stand, right? So this wasn't fiction. This really happened. Clarence Darrow put him on the stand, and so he was on the stand. And if you are familiar with this play, Inherit the Wind, I thought when I was a kid it might be fiction. Actually, most of the dialogue of the exchange between Darrow and Bryan is literally word for word from that trial. Okay, so he puts Bryan on the stand, and Bryan says quite correctly, after Darrow is basically, showing his creationism nonsense is nothing. He, in an exchange that probably convinced me as a child that this really was bunk, he goes, yeah, so Adam and Eve, they had a couple of sons, right? And Bryan goes, yeah. And he goes, well, but the only people born were from Adam and Eve, right? Right. And yet they had their sons, they had wives, right? Just let that sink in for a moment, folks. And he goes, right. And he goes, do you ever think about where they came from? And he goes, no, I don't think very much at all, basically. Right? But he later goes on to say, one miracle is as plausible as another.
Exactly.
And that's true. As soon as this is again the methodology issue, as soon as you resort to talking about miracles, then you are no longer talking science. Mm-hmm. All right? So where am I going with this? Where I'm going with this is as follows, right? Moderate theists are just as ridiculous as the fundies, except they lie about it. So if you go to polls, right, a large number of the, quote, moderate theists who will laugh at the creationists, who will mock them for their absurdities, will, when asked in scientific polls, say they believe in God-guided evolution. Okay? Once again, divine intervention. All right? So here's the thing. The scientific, what is a theory? What is a scientific theory? A theory isn't a hypothesis. It's an explanation. Mm-hmm. And used formally, and we use words formally and informally, but used formally, it's a well-established explanation that's supported and integrates information from a variety of disciplines. Okay? People, moderate theists with a straight face, say they believe in science, like Daniels was saying, you shouldn't, fight against the science. It's an embarrassment to do so. And then they'll claim, oh, yes, I also believe in God-guided evolution. If you know anything about the theory of evolution, right? Now, you don't have to be a trained biologist. Yeah. You don't have to have a PhD. You know that the theory of evolution is not that a divine magical being intervened and did X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
Those two are not compatible explanations. A supernatural explanation and a natural explanation are inherently incompatible. And yet, with a straight face, moderate theists will say, I believe in God-guided evolution. And other people will go, oh, yeah, okay, that makes sense. No, it does not compute. If I said to you, God-guided lightning bolts to strike the wicked are compatible with the scientific explanation of lightning bolts, everybody would realize this is absurd.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. If I say to you, well, I believe in evolution as a series of events, but it was God-guided, no. That is not the scientific explanation. It's a supernatural explanation, and science doesn't look to supernatural as explanations because why? Again, we go to method. Saying God did it can explain, in principle, everything, and hence it doesn't explain anything because an explanation that works just as well for the bad stuff as it does for the good stuff has no predictive power. So it really is an embarrassment that not only that people are saying this, but that so many other people are going, yeah, it makes sense. We can all get along. Group hug, scientists and theists, magical thinking and empirical investigation. They're not compatible. And stop lying to yourself that they are. You're seeking respect for an idea that doesn't deserve respect and a methodology that doesn't deserve respect. And you are just as absurd as the fundies, because as soon as you're invoking miracles, it doesn't matter what miracle you invoke.
it's answering one question with a mystery. It's answering one mystery with another mystery.
Yeah,
It doesn't work.
When we've broken down different arguments, religious arguments that are put forth by religious philosophers, we've broken down the appeal to mystery and stuff before.
So this is not science-based. Well, it could be. But I was wondering, since you're a professor, what is your opinion concerning free speech on college campuses and this whole debacle that we're seeing everybody talk about?
I support it. There is, as always, multiple factors have to be considered. So there's no single principle in the world that overrides all principles, such that the weight of this principle, no matter how small it applies, defeats all other principles, right? So let's be clear about that. But within very broad limits, yes, we should allow controversial ideas. What we shouldn't necessarily allow is under the wrong rubrics. So, for example, when I teach a class on human physiology, it is not appropriate, given that context, for me to teach my religious views. Now,
Yes.
that's true regardless of what my religious views are, right? Whether if I'm a moderate theist, I don't get to teach God-guided evolution. If I'm a creationist, I don't get to teach that God made the world 6,000 worlds, because I'm there as a professional to teach the field, and that's not what the field says. This is not my teaching job is not a platform my personal views. It's a platform for me to help educate students as to what the field says. So there's an example where in real world, people are challenging the evolution situation by saying this is a matter of free speech in classes. You're suppressing professors' free speech. No, you're not, right? This is what the field says. That's your job. And that was in part with my taking issue with what was called the accommodation policy back at the University of Utah, where professors and students could willfully I'm going to say conspire to omit information from the curriculum simply on the grounds that it conflicted with religious beliefs. And
Really?
Yes, really. And it's formal policy now. It is formal, real policy. There's a lot of important restrictions on it, but we could go there. But since we're getting towards the home stretch, I'll just say, yeah, there's important restrictions there that make it not as bad as that blanket statement. But the principle is incorrect, which is you don't delete information from the curriculum on the grounds that it conflicts with the instructor's beliefs or the student's beliefs. Same principle. Moving on to non-classroom situations, again, there are some limits, right? You cannot get up and advocate for murder of a particular individual, right? I mean, yeah, that's free speech, but it crosses the bounds of conflicting with another principle, which is inciting violence. That said, I'm much more receptive to the notion that people should be able to engage in hate speech of a certain nature that's not individually directed. Again, on the principle that if we start selecting out what speech is allowed on the basis of whether or not we as individuals like it, we're violating a very important principle as well. And so that's the nature of ethics in the real world, is that there's often two really important principles and they conflict. So I actually am in favor of the ACLU's championing the right of the Nazi Party to speak. I mean, I'm not in favor of Nazism, and nobody should misconstrue what I'm saying here. But if you get the government to regulate what's allowed and what's not allowed, that's an even deeper problem.
Yeah.
And so that's not to say that safety issues don't come to the rise, and there are certain things that, do have to put restrictions on. But cross burning on an individual's lawn is a place you can't go because that's private property and that's a threat against an individual. But promoting white supremacy, as loathsome and incorrect as that idea is, we also have to follow the principle that that speech per se is valid. And it's unfortunate that so many times now in both directions, people are trying to shut that down. Once upon a time, free speech, in my old day, back in the day, it was used as a way of targeting a liberal thought. And once you say it's a valid weapon, it's a secondary question as to where you're pointing it.
Yeah. We need to beat those bad arguments with good arguments.
Exactly.
It's not okay to punch a Nazi.
That's debatable.
Well, you may want to, but
Well, I mean,
freedom
again,
of speech,
that's actually an interesting point, which is at some point we weren't just punching them, we were bombing them.
yeah.
Right? And
Exactly.
so, that is the complexity of the real world. There's lots of really important ethical principles. And sometimes they conflict. Other things being equal, you don't go bombing people, right? But other things weren't being equal. They were killing millions of people in gas chambers. They were attacking lots of other folks.
Holocaust centers.
Yeah.
Sorry, Sean Spicer.
Yeah. But they didn't gas any of their own people. Oh, come on, please.
Yeah.
So there are times where these valid principles conflict.
So a question that I always like to ask people who are scientifically minded and passionate about it is what motivates you? What drives your passion to continue doing the work that you do, both outwardly with the op-eds and on your day-to-day basis?
Well, two things. One is benefiting people in a direct sense, and that is, particularly with my current line of work, a very real and very tangible possible benefit. In a deeper sense, it's a single word: curiosity.
Yeah.
There are lots of tangible benefits that come from science, but one of those less tangible but equally important benefits is that we're, as humans, learners. That exploring the universe and understanding the universe is of importance to us, whether or not it has immediate practical benefits. So I wrote an op-ed about that too a while back, and it's not just the benefits that come from the STEM fields in a practical sense, but our ability to explore and understand our universe. This was at a time when the governor of Wisconsin was trying to change the mission statement of the University of Wisconsin from something on the order of seeking truth and knowledge to better workforce development.
Oh, my God.
True story, right? And so I said, no, that's not the only point of education. It's not the only point of the STEM fields. And Clara Ma, who was this sixth grader or so whose suggestion was selected for the Mars rover, didn't name the Mars rover workforce development. She named it curiosity.
Yeah.
Right? And I was very impressed by my recollection of the time when there was the Venus transit across the sun a couple of years back. And I went up to the Museum of Natural History, and they had a wonderful exhibit there, telescopes. You could look at the sun. I'd never seen the sun in real time through the filters, and it's just amazing. It's this cauldron of fiery, broiling stuff just going on, and that was cool. But what was even more important was thinking back that in the days of the sailing ships, they set out sailing ships across the world to multiple locations, right? A lot of work, a lot of people involved, a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of danger to find out one thing, which was to use the clocking of the Venus transit across the sun to determine how far away the sun was from the Earth.
Yeah.
There was no immediate practical benefit to that, but the understanding of our place in the universe and what the universe was made of and how it interacted was of immense conceptual importance. And so in the end, it's not the practical benefits are very real, and the funding cuts that would be potentially imposed are going to have very real and very unfortunate consequences for us in a practical sense. But an even deeper issue is if we start attacking the methodology of science, then we are undercutting the enterprise as a whole, and that will have even more profound consequences.
Great. Thanks, Greg. I know I really enjoyed it. I'm sure Josh and Joe did.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
It was a blast. Thanks so much for having me, guys.
And maybe we can have you on again. Thanks for all the work you're doing. I really, really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. Thanks for listening, guys. Remember, you can find this podcast on Stitcher, on Spreaker, and on YouTube. You can join us on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/The Evil Atheists. And you can email us at recklesslyskeptical@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. You guys are awesome. And gals, thanks.
Thanks. That was a super fun podcast.